Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Glen Powell is racing to survive in Edgar Wright's remake of Stephen King's The Running Man. Set in an alternate near future, Ben Richards, played by Glen Powell, has just lost his job and he can't afford the money to save his sick daughter from the flu. Blacklisted and out of options, Richards applies to compete on a show for the network, which is more powerful than the government, and is selected for The Running Man, where contestants have to survive for 30 days, pursued by hunters. No one has ever survived, but Richards is determined to stay alive, becoming a face of revolution in the process. First published in 1982, The Running Man is one of the books that Stephen King first released under his Richard Bachman pseudonym, which you could basically describe as his angry young man persona. The Bachman books are notoriously bleak and nihilistic even for him, with major elements of political commentary. Only a few months ago, we had another one of King's Bachman works adapted as a film in The Long Walk, and it's striking how a story that was originally a commentary on Vietnam and the draft is eerily prescient in our deeply unsettled current moment. But that has nothing on The Running Man, where the first edition had a cover with a tagline that read, and let me use my best movie trailer voice here, "Welcome to America in 2025, when the best men don't run for president, they run for their lives." Yeah, that's a little bit unsettling to say the least. King's book was rather ahead of its time when it came to its commentary on media control and manipulation and violent sensationalism to placate the masses, things that feel especially relevant in the actual 2025 with media consolidation and politically motivated takeovers. Even reality television has caught up with the concept, with the Channel 4 show Hunted basically being The Running Man, but without the death part. Of course, it's probably better known to many people for the 1987 Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, which is based on the book, but only extremely loosely. One major difference is that instead of a global manhunt, it's more of a gladiatorial contest in a contained game zone, something which was largely down to budget concerns. I know there's a lot of people who have fondness for the Arnie flick growing up with it, and I'm one of them, and I cracked out my Blu-ray to revisit it for the first time in many years, and yeah, it is a flawed movie, and it was so when it came out, and it does look very dated now with its 80s game show aesthetics, but it is still quite an entertaining bit of cheese too, and manages to have some of the commentary of the source material in ways that feel very forward-thinking for 1987, like the sequence where the producers use what we would now call an AI deepfake to construct the death of Ben Richards for the television audience. But let's be honest, it is one of Arnie's weaker outings in what was his golden period in the late 80s and early 90s. Hell, it came out the same year as Predator, which also had Arnold and Jesse Ventura, and that movie is a stone cold classic. King was not a fan of the 87 film and thought that Arnold was nothing like the everyman he envisioned as Ben Richards, which explains why he was credited under a pseudonym even though his identity was known by then. Another person who wasn't a fan of it is Arnie himself, who has been quite critical of it over the years. He's been openly supportive of the remake, which even has a fun nod to the earlier film by making Schwarzenegger the face of the $100 bill scene. A lot of the classic Arnold movies have had later sequels and inferior remakes. I'm looking at you, Total Recall. But when I heard that The Running Man might be getting a do-over, I thought that was a prime candidate to be improved upon. You know who else thought that? Edgar Wright. Wright was a big fan of the book, having read it in his teens, and was disappointed by the previous adaptation, and this is a film that can be traced back to a tweet. In 2017, someone asked Wright if there was a film he would ever want to remake, and he answered, The Running Man. Apparently, a few years later, producer Simon Kinberg saw this, rang up Wright and said, "I've got the rights to the book, do you want to direct this?" And Wright also co-writes the script with Michael Bacall, who he previously worked with on adapting Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and their film is much closer to the source material, pretty much hitting all the major plot beats of the book. That's why it's not really fair to compare the films too much, because despite being based on the same source material, they're wildly different from each other. It's like apples and oranges. Aside from some character names, the basic premise, and some themes, they have little in common. If you like the Arnie film, mostly cast it aside and think of the 2025 film as a companion piece. Stepping into the running shoes is Glen Powell, and I will fully admit that I've been on the Glen Powell train ever since Hitman, where he was so charismatic and charming and had absolutely dynamite comic timing. I imported this from Germany, hence the different title. He clearly has got the chops to be a big star, and The Running Man is certainly a showcase for that, as he has to pretty much carry the film in virtually every single scene. Richards is a bit more the everyman he was supposed to be in the book, who is stuck in poverty like many others. He's just trying to provide for his family, but struggles to hold down a job, even ones working in dangerously radioactive environments. We in fact first meet him getting fired for trying to unionise, and he's constantly trying to help and save those around him, even if it's usually at the cost to himself, getting branded insubordinate or beaten up. It's little wonder why he has a temper, and Powell plays Richards with a barely suppressed rage, a fury at a cruelly unjust world that seems to conspire against him. When he takes an assessment for the network, he snarks his way through with contempt. Anarchy? When? Justice? Hilarious. He doesn't want to be on the show, but that's what he gets picked for. But he's a desperate man who knows he's been effectively handed a death sentence and is resolved to get back to his family and destroy the network are what drives him. And if you dare insult his wife and kid, he will kill you. Powell is immensely watchable, but the role does ask him to veer between that volatile intensity to more comic scenes, and sometimes that can make his performance a little inconsistent. And ever since Hitman, Powell's taken several roles that require him to wear disguises, like the show Chad Powers, which kind of makes it seem like he picks roles on the basis of, do I wear a funny disguise? Then yes. And Powell is amusing wearing an outrageous disguise, like a bit where he hides as a blind priest, but that broad comedy can fit uneasily with Richards' characterisation at points. I also think the 2025 film comes out of the blocks a little slower than expected in the first act, mostly because there's a lot to set up early on, as you've got Richards' home life, getting his place on the show, set up Killian and the other contestants, and the rules of the Running Man. And even when Richards is released out of the studio, he's got a 12-hour head start, so the game doesn't really start until that point. That's a lot of ground to cover, even with Wright trying to make it as pacey as possible. Because of that, some elements don't get enough room to breathe as they could. Richards' daughter and his wife Sheila, played by Jamie Lawson, are his motivation, but they're only really in a couple of scenes together before Richards goes out on the show. In fact, the whole point is that Ben doesn't actually know what has happened to them and whether Killian has actually kept to his word about keeping them safe. But it does mean that they don't get a lot of characterisation despite their importance. Wright and Bacall's script sticks to King's book by keeping the film very much from the perspective of Richards, so we see things how he sees them, and he increasingly doesn't know which way is up, as most of his updates come from the manipulations of the show. We need to experience that paranoia and distrust as part of the film's tension, but the downside is that Richards is the only really developed character in the entire film. The other supporting cast members are mostly transitory, largely in for a stretch, and then back out again. There's a road movie aspect to this version, massively opening up the scale as Richards runs from one location to the next, and UK viewers can do the Leo point when they recognise London landmarks like Wembley or bits of Glasgow doubling for dilapidated American cities. That said, Wright and Bacall do limit things a bit more than the book. It was global there, whereas the film just keeps it to America, with Richards trying to cross into Canada being a plot point later on, and let's be honest, America's plenty big enough already. You could definitely make the argument that the more contained approach of the 87 film made for a more focused story, even if it lacked in scope, but the 2025 film is sprawling and ambitious. That it rarely sticks around too long keeps things fresh despite the drawbacks. Wright knows that he has to make the episodic structure work by filling the film top to bottom with lots of recognisable character actors in his usual style, some better utilised than others. For example, William H. Macy Casey is largely squandered as a friend of Richard's running an underground shop that provides him with his disguises. Casey O'Brien and Please Don't Destroy's Martin Hurley play Richard's fellow contestants, who are a wildcard and comically hopeless respectively, but they're mostly only briefly glimpsed on the show. On the other hand, Scott Pilgrim himself, Michael Cera, pops up as revolutionary Elton, who gives Richards a safe house, and Cera absolutely steals this film in his roughly 10 minutes of screen time. That whole sequence is by far its biggest standout, from a crazed Sandra Dickinson as his brainwashed mother to the Home Alone style booby traps evading the bad guys, and Cera's playing this like he's completely out of his mind, getting a monologue about his dad's hot dog cart. He's absolutely hilarious, and it has the invention that we've come to expect from Wright. In fact, I'd say the film really comes to life during the action sequences, and it's around the time of a long set piece in the YWA, about 40 minutes or so in, where the film started to click for me. Those are the parts of the film where you can really feel Wright's presence, from a continuous shot running through the halls, a clever gag with a broken lift, the why gag. They're all reminders of just how good Wright is at staging action but mixing in a bit of comedy. Powell even gets to have a bona fide Die Hard moment sneaking around the hunters and skating down the building in a towel, and John McClane thought he had it rough in bare feet. All of which gives Powell plenty to prove himself as an action hero with rippling abs. So you've got something for everyone there. And luckily those action moments are fairly frequent because they remind you you're watching an Edgar Wright film, because I did feel that this sometimes lacked his usual flair. I'm not sure why. Maybe Wright just toned himself down because he didn't want to get in the way of King's story. Maybe it's because it's his biggest studio film to date, or maybe also because this was made very fast for a film of its size, going from filming to completion in just a year. I know he's more than the hyperkinetic energy of the Cornetto films, but Last Night in Soho still felt like a Wright film despite being a departure. You go to an Edgar Wright film because he has such a distinctive voice in his direction, and it is still here. I just wished it was a little bit more on display. But maybe his voice is more in the way that it adapts the material. Wright and Bacall's script tries to faithfully bring to the screen King's brutal dystopia, but also mixes in a bit of action comedy to bring a bit of levity, because this is a Friday night popcorn movie after all. As I said earlier, this does lead to a bit of an uneasy balance at times when it comes to the film's tone, as it can shift back and forth quite quickly. But I think Wright really connects with the satire, especially when it comes to the Running Man show itself and the manipulation of media, particularly the way it can be weaponized to turn people against each other. Josh Brolin plays the show's producer Killian, and I've tried to avoid comparing, but it's hard not to think of Family Feud host Richard Dawson's performance in the 1987 film, deliciously playing an evil version of himself that easily steals the film from Arnold. Brolin doesn't scale those heights, but he's not supposed to. This incarnation of Killian is much more of a behind-the-scenes figure, preferring to keep out of the cameras, but he's always pulling the strings from the safety of his office, sometimes appearing by video message. We might not see Killian as much here, but his presence is often felt. Brolin makes the most out of his screen time, particularly in a lengthy first interview with Richards, and his veneered teeth making him a truly vile, soulless executive who is all business and believes he's untouchable. You really want Richards to make good on his threat to fuck him up and get his comeuppance. But the Dawson role from the earlier film merged several characters from the book together, so this brings in host Bobby Thompson, or Bobby T as he goes by here, from King's Source, who is the public face of the show. Coleman Domingo is clearly having a whale of a time getting to totally ham it up for the crowd, as a host who is keenly aware he's complicit in the lies and deceit, but hey, that's show business, baby. Gotta give the crowd what they want, and as long as he gets paid, that's just fine. Lee Pace is the lead hunter, Evan McCone, and Pace manages to make him a memorable figure despite spending almost the entire time with his face covered in a mask and sunglasses. In fact, the mask has little holes for the sunnies to sit in, which is a nice touch. But even though he's effectively faceless, he still cuts an intimidating presence, mostly performing with his physicality and gestures. And again, I know I keep saying that I won't do comparisons, but there was definitely a part of me that did miss how the Stalkers, as they were called in the 87 flick, were memorably over-the-top caricatures, clearly inspired by professional wrestling. McCone in the 2025 film is largely the figurehead, and the others are mostly literal goon squads here, but I get it, because there's already a lot of characters. Still kinda miss them though. But Wright really sinks his teeth into the satire on class division, media suppression, and surveillance culture. This is a game where the public is actively encouraged to find and report the contestants, and even actively try to hunt them down. Although there's even class division there, because Killian wants the show's featured hunters to get the kills. The idea of people pulling out their phones to film strangers in public, judging and policing their behaviour, is something we're already seeing. And dystopian sci-fi is meant to be a funhouse mirror of the times they were made in, and it speaks to the perceptiveness of the source material that it wasn't too far off the mark already, and Wright only makes it more relevant. There's definitely a Verhoeven-like edge to the material, particularly in the way the show is presented, and the in-universe product placements, or the stabs at reality television. There's a recurring gag about a show called The Americanos, which is clearly a send-up of the Kardashians and Real Housewives, made even funnier by the fact that it's not even that much of an exaggeration. It's only marred by having some actual product placements mixed in, like Liquid Death, Monster, and Puma, despite the overall anti-capitalist message. There was already some of that satire in the 87 film, and that came out in the same year as RoboCop, and those very much reflect the mood of the late 80s Reagan era that they came out in. I think it's telling that we're getting all these Bachman adaptations or other recent movies with revolutionary fervour like one battle after another. They hit the spot for the political mood right now. But Wright and Bacall really run with commentary on AI in particular, pun completely intended there, something which was already a theme in the book, but is especially contemporary now. Killian is constantly altering the narrative to make everything more sensational and to whip up the bloodlust of his viewers, to turn them against their fellow citizens and keep them controlled. It creates a landscape which is hard to work out what the truth even is, because everything is so distorted by the network. And the film isn't subtle about this stuff, but you know what? These are unsubtle times, so I don't really care. Occasionally our sophistication with these ideas does mean that the plotting retained from the book, where this was more speculative, can work against it, like Richards recording a message about a cover-up with pollution and then being surprised that he's not just censored, but he's now saying inflammatory remarks that he never said in the first place. Him just expecting them to play out his expose on the air uncut just makes him look very naive. Speaking of that though, Wright and Bacall, because they're playing with an alternate timeline, rather than updating all the anachronistic elements of a book that was published in the 80s, have chosen to keep some of them in. Specifically that Richards has to record what is basically a 10-minute vlog every day, and then physically post it to the studio, and try not to get caught doing it, otherwise he forfeits the prize money. And he records these not with a phone, but with a portable camera on tapes. This is all clearly done on purpose, so there isn't a specific time or setting, but also it kind of contributes to a bit of an analog versus digital theme running through it. Killian and the network control all this increasingly advanced technology, whereas the Resistance use a lot of traditional media to keep underground, like Elton publishing a zine called The Truth, or slide projectors, all these kind of lo-fi solutions. Daniel Ezra plays Bradley, who lets Richards stay at his place, where he's making what are basically send-ups of obsessive YouTube essayists, exposing the lies of the network, trying to make these exposition dumps into gags, but he's circulating them on tapes like they're MST3K bootlegs. The movie has to take Richards from Public Enemy #1 to the face of a revolution in 2 hours, but he reluctantly starts to accept that his survival gives people the hope to fight back. It's something that mostly lands, better than Arnie's movie, where it happens in just a night, but it is still a little rushed. Amelia Jones turns up in the film's third act as Amelia, a consumerist Americanos fan that Richards takes hostage, whose own worldview is challenged now that she's involved in the game and sees the distortions for herself. Amelia is meant to represent the change in Richards among the people, but it still feels a little bit weird to have a major character pop up so late and then play a significant role in the film's climax. But hey, that is exactly how it is in the book as well. Ironically, like many King books, the scale of it means that it probably needed the runtime of television to give the material the space that it truly needs. Speaking of which, the ending is one area where it massively differs from the book, namely because the book's ending is completely unadaptable after September 11th. Even now, that ain't gonna fly, let's just put it that way. Wright and Bacall get as close as they can to it, but then they have to do their own wrap-up. It's a conclusion that ties up the loose ends and gives people a crowd-pleasing ending, but it feels quite rushed into the last few minutes, not helped by a Bradley exposition dump which is trying to be playful, but just comes across as clumsy. If you had to invent a new ending, it's not a bad one, but it just needed more room for the catharsis to land. I know this review has been quite mixed, so I want to be clear. I really like the 2025 Running Man and had a lot of fun with it. It's a better adaptation, and it's a better made film than its predecessor, in my opinion, but it isn't a perfect film, and I know for certain that some people will prefer the Arnie movie, and hey, that's fine too. I like both for different reasons. I will admit that my expectations for this were quite high, so that's probably why I'm a bit nitpicky, and this is a big, enjoyable blockbuster, but I also think that it's so big from what it's trying to adapt that it almost threatens to overwhelm Wright. That said, this gets a lot right, and that so much of the commentary from the book has survived into the film especially, even if I do think The Long Walk is the superior of the two. And yes, the irony hasn't escaped me that this is being released by Paramount of all companies, and their new owners at Skydance and the Ellisons, who have made headlines this year for being exactly the kind of media company that this is trying to send up. I do think this is Edgar Wright's weakest film today. I know Last Night in Soho was divisive, but I still enjoyed that film quite a bit, and he hasn't made a film yet that I haven't liked. But I would like to see Wright maybe doing something a bit smaller or back to basics next time, because his directorial voice is too important to lose to the network, if you know what I mean. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature which is right below the video. Or you can keep me on my feet over on my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and hype the video, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.